In the early years of the Battle of the Atlantic from 1940 to 1942, the ocean between North America and Britain became a place of dread, a vast killing ground where the hunters were unseen and the hunted rarely survived long enough to understand what had destroyed them. The German U-boats slipped through the waves like shadows, patient, silent, deadly. Their periscopes broke the surface only for seconds. Their torpedoes left no warning. Their engines hummed beneath hundreds of feet of dark water, while Allied convoys crawled across the sea like helpless cattle in a field of wolves. Night after night, the U-boat commanders launched coordinated attacks, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard lit by burning oil slicks and sinking ships. Crews aboard Allied destroyers and corvettes fought desperately to protect the merchantmen, but their tools were crude and often unreliable. Depth charges were powerful but imprecise. They exploded around a suspected position but only rarely on it. And every time a destroyer passed directly over a contact, the sonar beam lost the submarine, leaving the hunters blind at the most critical moment. The sailors called it the blackout zone. Beneath the hull, the U-boats went silent, drifting while the destroyer raced helplessly ahead. By the time the sonar reacquired the target, the submarine had slipped away into the deep, or worse, positioned itself for a counterattack. To the men on those warships, there was nothing more terrifying than knowing an enemy submarine was somewhere beneath them, possibly within torpedo range, and yet being unable to track it. A lookout aboard the destroyer HMS Hesperus wrote in his diary, "Every convoy we escorted felt like marching through a dark forest, hearing twigs snap, knowing something was out there waiting to strike. Every splash in the water, every flicker of moonlight across the waves carried the promise of danger. A periscope glint, a torpedo wake, a sharp metallic echo on sonar." Long before the Allies found a way to fight effectively, the U-boats reigned supreme. They hunted in wolf packs, coordinated attacks using radio codes and exploiting Allied weaknesses. A handful of submarines could tear apart entire convoys. Sometimes 8 or 10 merchant ships went down in a single night, leaving thousands of tons of cargo sinking to the bottom. Food, fuel, ammunition, and lives lost in black water lit only by fire. Among Allied sailors, morale began to wither. Men spoke quietly in mess halls and bunk rooms, sharing stories of ships vaporized in explosions or of survivors plucked from lifeboats telling how torpedoes struck without warning, followed by a second hit to break a ship completely in half. The worst were tales of destroyers sprinting after sonar contacts only to lose them, then hearing moments later the deep, echoey thud of a torpedo hitting a merchantman elsewhere in the convoy. Many felt they were not fighting an enemy, but something elemental, unpredictable, and immortal. A U-boat did not have to win every fight, only survive long enough to strike again. A depth charge run might shake the submarine but rarely destroyed it. Experienced German captains dove deep, let explosions thunder above them, then waited for the surface ship to give up or run out of charges. A U-boat crewman later recalled, "We were afraid of depth charges but not destroyed by them. They were the fists of a blind giant, strong but never precise." The Allies knew this truth too painfully well. Sometimes they dropped dozens of charges without even damaging the target. In 1942 alone, nearly 8 million tons of shipping were lost, an unimaginable weight of steel and cargo scattered across the ocean floor. The British Admiralty grew desperate. The Americans rushed to reinforce convoys. The Canadians stretched their tiny navy thin across the endless sea. But nothing seemed to turn the tide. Then, in the winter of 1942, something new arrived quietly. It did not look impressive. A spiky launcher bolted to the bow of a destroyer, firing dozens of small projectiles at once. Sailors mocked it, calling it a rack of pipes or a farmer's pitchfork. It had no roar like a deck gun, no massive shockwave like a depth charge. No one believed such small weapons could change the greatest naval struggle in history. It was called Hedgehog. And though few realized it at the time, this strange, untested contraption would become the single most important innovation in the war beneath the waves. For now, though, in the cold years before it proved its worth, the Atlantic still belonged to the hunters. Steel coffins lurked below the convoys, patient and deadly, and the men on Allied ships wondered each night whether they would see the dawn. The surface belonged to them, but the deep belonged to Germany. And until something new emerged, something that could strike with precision, not luck, the U-boats would continue their reign, turning the ocean into a cemetery marked not by crosses, but by oil slicks, drifting under a moonlit sky. When the Hedgehog first appeared on the bows of Allied destroyers in early 1943, few sailors believed it could make any difference in the brutal, unseen war unfolding beneath the Atlantic waves. It looked nothing like a weapon that could end the reign of the feared U-boats. Instead of massive steel drums like depth charges, the Hedgehog was only a cluster of slender, spigot mortars arranged in two neat rows pointing forward at a slight angle. The projectiles themselves looked like awkward metal darts, too small, too light to threaten the thick pressure hull of a German submarine. Men joked that it resembled a farmer's pitchfork or a bundle of fireworks taped together, hardly the tool to stop the wolves of the Atlantic. The Hedgehog fired 24 or sometimes 48 contact bombs in a forward-arcing pattern. The projectiles left the launchers silently, except for a soft cough of compressed propellant, then arced out over the bow, landing in a tight circle far ahead of the ship before plunging into the sea. They sank fast, following a predictable descent path, and here was the innovation that changed everything. They exploded only on direct contact. Depth charges detonated at preset depths, creating massive pressure waves that might injure a submarine or crack a weld, but often did nothing because they relied on guesswork. Hedgehog rounds worked differently. If a projectile touched steel, it detonated instantly and with devastating precision. If not, they simply sank to the bottom and disappeared without producing a single blast. For many sailors, this was unsettling. The silence after a Hedgehog salvo made it feel as though nothing had happened. But that quiet was exactly what sonar operators needed. For the first time, a destroyer could attack without losing contact because there was no need to pass directly over the target and no underwater explosions to blind the sonar with noise. The ship held course, the sonar continued pinging, and the U-boat had nowhere to hide. The moment a projectile hit the submarine, a sharp, single underwater explosion echoed upward, a clean, unmistakable signal of destruction. Depth charge attacks often created huge plumes of water and thunderous roars, shaking the entire ship. Even when the crew missed, the spectacle made them feel as though something had been accomplished. Hedgehog was almost the opposite. There was no roar, no shaking, no geyser of water. Only the sudden sharp thump of a contact hit. A quiet, violent certainty that somewhere beneath the waves, steel had cracked and a submarine was dying. The first real test came in the North Atlantic on a cold night when a British destroyer, HMS Westcott, tracked a U-boat trying to slip around the edge of a convoy. The sonar operator kept the contact steady, reporting bearing changes with growing confidence. The captain ordered Hedgehog ready, then fire. The crew waited in tense anticipation, but no explosions followed, only silence. For a moment, men exchanged uneasy glances. Then it happened. A single, sharp, underwater blast echoed through the hull. A cheer rose from the crew. They had not just guessed the submarine's depth or detonated charges blindly, they had hit the target dead on. That hit changed everything. News spread quickly across Allied fleets. Hedgehog had proven itself not with noise, but with accuracy. Its first kill demonstrated the brutal efficiency that would become its hallmark. A depth charge attack might require dozens of explosives. Hedgehog often needed only one hit to break a U-boat's back. As more ships received the weapon, Allied commanders began to understand its strategic power. A destroyer no longer needed to rush over a submarine's last known position, losing sonar contact in the process. Instead, it could maintain a constant track, adjusting its course in real time, attacking repeatedly with precise salvos. Depth charges required a destroyer to gamble on timing and distance. Hedgehog allowed it to hunt scientifically. The numbers told the story. A depth charge run might achieve a kill in 1 out of 80 attacks. With Hedgehog, the kill rate rose to 1 out of 5, sometimes 1 out of 3 when used by experienced crews. The impact was immediate. Convoys that had previously lost ship after ship now sailed with an invisible shield. U-boats began reporting that Allied escorts could attack without warning, without losing contact, and with frightening accuracy. German captains soon feared the sound of a steady sonar ping more than the explosions themselves, because a steady ping meant a Hedgehog was likely seconds away. Sailors began speaking of the new weapon with a mixture of awe and relief. They had seen the ocean swallow friends and ships without mercy, and now for the first time they had a tool that struck back with precision rather than luck. A petty officer aboard USS England later described the first time he watched a Hedgehog hit. The depth charges used to shake the entire ship, and we never knew if they did anything. The Hedgehog did the opposite. No noise, no shaking, just one clean explosion. That told you somebody down there just died. By mid-1943, Allied shipyards worked at full speed, mounting Hedgehog on anything that could carry it: destroyers, corvettes, frigates, sloops, even converted merchant ships. By the end of the war, more than 5,000 Allied vessels carried the launcher, each one becoming a deadly hunter capable of sinking a submarine with a single perfect strike. As Hedgehog spread across the Atlantic, German submarine warfare began to falter. Its strength had always been stealth. U-boats attacked from the dark and vanished before escorts could respond. But now the escorts struck first and struck accurately. The reign of the U-boat did not end in a dramatic battle. It ended quietly, with the soft cough of a Hedgehog launch, followed by a single explosion deep below the waves. The sailors who once felt powerless finally had a weapon that turned the hunters into the hunted. The ocean was beginning to change, and soon the U-boat captains would understand the truth. The Atlantic was no longer theirs to rule. By the time Hedgehog spread across the Allied fleets in 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was evolving into something the Germans had never prepared for. The Allies were no longer a collection of desperate escorts reacting to attacks. They were becoming hunters, relentless, disciplined, and equipped with tools that worked together with deadly precision. Sonar, radar, and Hedgehog, each powerful on their own, became unstoppable when combined. And when placed in the hands of the new hunter-killer groups, the U-boat reign began to crumble. The transformation started with radar. In the early years of the war, U-boats could surface at night and attack convoys from the shadows. Their decks slipped across the waves, almost invisible, and their speed on the surface allowed them to outrun most escorts. But radar changed this forever. The new centimetric radar sets could detect even the narrow silhouette of a periscope head, or the small hump of a snorkel cutting across the waves. German captains who once surfaced freely at night now found themselves bathed in the eerie glow of radar tracking beams moments before Allied guns opened fire. The ocean no longer belonged to the night. It belonged to whoever saw first, and the Allies now saw everything. At the same time, sonar operators had grown far more skilled. The steady ping they listened to became as familiar as their own breathing. They learned to detect subtle changes in tone, recognizing when a submarine turned silently, when it increased depth, when it drifted to break contact. This new generation of sonar men transformed listening into an art. Their discipline allowed escorts to track U-boats for hours, sometimes days, without losing contact. The enemy below could no longer hide beneath the convoy or slip away between explosions. The sonar kept singing, and the Hedgehog waited to strike. But the greatest change came not from any single tool, but from the shift in Allied strategy. In 1941 and 1942, escorts existed to protect convoys. They circled the merchant ships, formed screens, and reacted when U-boats attacked. But by 1943, a new philosophy emerged, one that fundamentally changed the battle: the hunter-killer group. Instead of defending convoys, these groups roamed the Atlantic,
actively searching for submarines. They operated around small escort carriers whose aircraft could spot periscopes, patrol vast stretches of ocean, and follow U-boats until destroyers could rush in for the kill. The Allies stopped defending and began hunting. For the first time, German submarine commanders were no longer predators. They were prey. One of the first and most effective groups centered around the escort carrier USS Bogue. Its aircraft spotted U-boats from miles away, forcing them to dive. Then destroyers armed with Hedgehog raced in, guided by sonar, attacks becoming a dance of precision. The moment sonar held steady, the captain ordered fire, and a swarm of Hedgehog bombs arced high over the bow and fell silently toward the target. The sea trembled when the single explosion cracked deep below. U-boat crews began sending desperate messages, reporting aircraft appearing without warning, escort ships arriving faster than they could escape, and Hedgehog strikes so accurate it felt as though the enemy could see through the ocean itself. One surviving German radioman wrote later, "We did not fear the depth charges anymore. They were loud, but they did not always find us. Hedgehog was different. It was the strike of a spear we could not outrun. Once we heard the sonar, we knew the next sound might be the end." By mid-1944, Hedgehog had been paired with high-frequency direction-finding, radar-equipped patrol planes, enhanced sonar, and coordinated attack tactics. A U-boat detected on the surface by radar at night found itself forced to dive. Once underwater, sonar acquired it and held it pinned. Then the destroyer moved into perfect range, not too close, not too far, and unleashed Hedgehog rounds in precise patterns. Across the Atlantic, U-boat losses skyrocketed. In the first years of the war, dozens of submarines could operate in wolf packs. Now, many never made it past their first patrol. The survival rate collapsed. German high command watched in alarm as entire flotillas vanished. Their commanders reported that convoys were now impossible to approach. Aircraft forced them to dive, escorts held contact, and Hedgehog provided the killing blow. Nothing in the German arsenal could counter this, and their once fearless captains began describing the ocean not as a hunting ground, but as a vast trap lined with invisible eyes and patient destroyers. The hunter-killer groups, especially those built around escort carriers like USS Card, USS Bogue, HMS Vindex, and HMS Tracker, became legendary. They destroyed U-boats with a consistency that shocked even their own crews. What had once been the most feared weapon in the Atlantic had become something cornered and hunted. The ocean floor began to fill with wrecks. German submarines smashed open by direct Hedgehog hits or left broken by sonar-guided precision attacks. The Atlantic itself had changed. Its rules were rewritten, and the U-boats were no longer riding them. The combination of radar, sonar, and Hedgehog turned the tide, not in a single dramatic battle, but in hundreds of small, silent, lethal encounters where a ping, a sweep, and a volley of spiked projectiles decided the fate of steel coffins in the deep. By 1944, German submarine crews no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival. And many no longer believed they would return home at all.
By 1944, every German U-boat captain entering the Atlantic knew the truth long before he saw it, felt it, or heard it. The ocean had changed. It no longer felt like the silent hunting ground they once ruled, but like a vast empty field where unseen predators waited above and around and beyond their reach. Submariners who had sailed with swagger in 1941 now boarded their boats with tight jaws and eyes that avoided the families waving goodbye on the pier. The fear was not of the enemy they could see, but of the one they could not. The one who hunted them with sound and radar, and a new weapon that destroyed them with a single violent touch: Hedgehog. The early days of the U-boat war had been defined by confidence. German crews believed they were invisible, untouchable masters of the deep. But by 1943, survivors returning from patrol brought back a different kind of story. Stories not of triumph, but of being chased for endless hours by sonar pings that pierced the submarine like needles in the dark. Stories of destroyers that never lost contact, even during evasive turns, even during silent running, even in the deepest layers of cold water. Stories of sudden explosions, not deafening like depth charges, but sharp, precise, close, too close. Then silence. Deadly silence. Hedgehog was unlike anything the Germans had known. Depth charges terrified them, but they could survive those blasts. A skilled captain could dive deep, angle the hull, and ride out the violence, hedging his life on timing and instinct. But Hedgehog did not explode around the submarine. It exploded on it. Only when its projectile struck steel. And when it did, the pressure crack ripped the hull apart like tearing paper. A German engineer who survived a Hedgehog strike on a sister submarine described it later. Depth charges were storms. Hedgehog was a knife. And the knife always found flesh. When U-boats surfaced, even briefly, radio men caught terrifying transmissions from other U-boats, abrupt, incomplete messages that ended mid-sentence before cutting into static. No coordinates, no calls for help, only fragments like, under attack, sonar locked, bearing east, or bombs falling. Silence, no explosions, then nothing. The silence was the worst sign of all. When a U-boat was struck by Hedgehog, there were rarely survivors, rarely signals, rarely time for anything except the brutal shock of water punching through ruptured steel. The German Naval Command, BDU, realized the scale of the disaster far too late. They scrambled to equip submarines with better detection gear, radar warning receivers, improved sonar shields, snorkels, anything to break Allied contact. But each new patrol returned with fewer men, fewer boats, fewer stories of success. Many U-boat commanders wrote in their logs that sonar no longer sounded like a distant tapping. It sounded like a heartbeat hunting them, slow, steady, inescapable. They felt it through the hull, a rhythm that tightened their throats and froze their nerves. One captain wrote in 1944, "We could hear our death coming before we saw it, and we never saw it." The psychological fear spread faster than the losses themselves. Submariners, once trained to be hunters, now felt like trapped animals. The moment sonar pings struck the hull, they whispered to each other, "They have us. They always have us." Hedgehog amplified this terror because its silence before impact made it worse. A depth charge run delivered warning, roaring explosions, shaking the submarine brutally, but giving the crew some sense of location and danger. Hedgehog gave nothing. No clues, no countdown, no echo of turbulence. Just the soft sound of projectiles falling through water, then a sudden sharp crack. Then darkness. Another U-boat survivor described the moment simply. One explosion. The lights went out. The bow tore off. I remember water and screaming, then nothing. U-boat captains altered their tactics in desperation. They dove deep, but Allied sonar followed. They turned tight, but escorts matched every movement. They ran silently, but aircraft forced them to surface where radar caught them even faster. Every option that once guaranteed survival was now met with a counter. Every escape path had a hunter waiting. Allied hunter-killer groups were relentless. Aircraft forced the submarine to dive. Sonar held them pinned. Hedgehog finished the job. The sequence happened so often that German officers began referring to it darkly as the chain of death. And at the center of that chain sat the weapon they feared most. In internal memos, German naval intelligence conceded a shocking truth. Hedgehog kills instantly. Depth charges rarely do. The numbers told the same story. In 1940, the average U-boat could expect multiple patrols. In 1944, most did not survive their first. After years of dominance, the U-boat arm was bleeding out, and every captain knew it. The once proud fleet that had threatened to starve Britain now found itself dying in silence beneath the waves, cobalt wrecks sinking into the cold black layers of the Atlantic. From their cramped steel hulls, the Germans could feel the change, not as statistics or reports, but as dread. The ocean no longer felt like home. It felt like a coffin waiting to be sealed. And every sonar ping echoed inside their heads with the same chilling meaning. You are found, you are marked, you are next.
By the end of 1944, anyone who understood the Battle of the Atlantic knew the truth, even if they whispered it only in quiet corners of command rooms or scribbled it into private logbooks. The U-boat arm was dying. Not in a blaze of glory, not in decisive fleet battles, but in cold silence beneath gray water. The hunters of 1940 had become the hunted of 1944, and the transformation was so absolute that even German naval command could no longer deny it. Hedgehog had not simply entered the war, it had rewritten it. The weapon was small, unimpressive, almost strange to behold, a cluster of tubes jutting from a destroyer's bow. Yet it had turned the ocean into a trap. For decades, submarine warfare was built on a simple belief that if a submarine was stealthy enough, it could always escape. That belief died the moment Allied commanders paired Hedgehog with radar, sonar, and the hunter-killer groups. The U-boat myth had been built on invincibility. The Allies shattered it with mathematics, discipline, and a weapon that punished even the smallest mistake. A submarine detected by radar at night was forced to dive. The moment it submerged, sonar acquired it. The moment sonar locked on, the destroyer closed in. And the moment the destroyer held position, Hedgehog flew forward in a silent arc, leaving no time for evasive maneuvers. Depth charges gave submarines a chance. Hedgehog gave them none. In the past, submarines could survive dozens of depth charges rattling their hulls, bending pipes, cracking gauges, but still limping home. Hedgehog changed that. Each hit was final, precise, and lethal. Its projectiles did not shake the water around a target. They struck the target itself, exploding with pinpoint fury, tearing steel plates apart, crushing compartments, and flooding the hull in seconds. German records from late 1944 and early 1945 are filled with chilling patterns. U-boats vanished with no final message, no distress call, no debris field, just silence. They had been hit by Hedgehog rounds that detonated directly against the hull, killing the submarine so quickly it could not even signal its death. It was as if the Atlantic swallowed them whole. The toll grew, impossible to conceal. The German Navy, once proud of its U-boat arm, watched its strength collapse patrol by patrol, month by month, submarines disappearing faster than they could be built, faster than crews could be trained, faster than replacements could even be found. Experienced captains were lost early, leaving newer crews to face technology they did not understand and tactics they could not counter. Many never returned from their first mission. Meanwhile, Allied hunter-killer groups swept across the ocean like patient predators. Escort carriers launched aircraft that combed the sea from above. Destroyers and frigates tracked sonar contacts relentlessly, and Hedgehog finished the job with chilling efficiency. What had once been a war fought on chance and instinct had become a science of destruction, precise, methodical, and merciless. Admiral Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, understood better than anyone what this shift represented. He had watched the darkest years when U-boats roamed freely, slaughtering convoys and threatening to starve Britain into submission. And he lived to see the reversal. He said the words that defined the change. Hedgehog did not just sink U-boats. It buried the idea of their invincibility. That quote was not poetic exaggeration. It was a literal description of the strategic reality. Before Hedgehog, the U-boat had been considered the perfect predator. After Hedgehog, it was simply another target. German morale collapsed. Some captains flatly refused to take their boats to sea. Others wrote farewell letters before leaving port, acknowledging that the odds were hopeless. One commander said to his crew, "If sonar finds us once, we will not survive." Being hunted had replaced being feared. The ocean no longer belonged to the wolf packs. It belonged to technology, to coordination, and to relentless Allied pressure, and to a weapon that hit with surgical certainty. The Atlantic itself began to change, not physically, but in reputation. The same waters that once swallowed Allied shipping now swallowed the submarines that had preyed on them. Escort vessels no longer trembled at the arrival of a sonar echo. They pursued it with confidence, knowing that Hedgehog gave them a killing edge. And as wreck after wreck fell to the seabed, the myth of the U-boats collapsed with them. The Allies no longer fought with hope. They fought with expectation. By 1945, the U-boat arm was no longer a threat. It was a memory, a ghost of fear replaced by a new reality. The ocean had new rulers,
and they hunted with sound, steel, and precision. The Hedgehog stood silent on the bows of more than 5,000 Allied ships by war's end. A humble-looking weapon, lacking glamour, lacking size, lacking roar. Yet it transformed the greatest naval struggle of the 20th century. It made victory possible, not through power, but through certainty. And as the war closed and the last U-boats surrendered at sea, the sailors who had lived through the terror of the early years understood that something extraordinary had happened. A small spiked projectile had ended a legend. There was no ceremony, no parade, only the quiet truth that a weapon few had believed in had brought an empire of submarines to its knees. Hedgehog had not just sunk U-boats. It had ended the reign of terror beneath the Atlantic and written the final chapter of a myth that once seemed unbreakable.